Good. Well, I'm glad you're here. And we'll just enjoy a good discussion together. I hope something will be helpful from a Canadian perspective. There's some good similarities between what we do of Canada and what you do down here, but there are some differences, and we can talk about those. And then I thought we would also share a little bit of some ministry models that reflect these different avenues and ways that refugees come to Canada as a bit of a practical, hands-on reflection of ministry there. Let's just take a minute to pray. Lord God, we're grateful that you unite us as the body of Christ, different regions of the world, different countries, different ministries, and yet we're all moving towards that goal of your kingdom on earth. And so thank you for our time together this morning, and may you be present with us and with all of the other groups as they meet and gather this morning. That it'll be helpful, and we will learn and be encouraged, inspired, and moved as you call us into your service. Thank you. Amen. So this is, come on in, come join us in the front row.
Morning.
Good to have you here. So we'll just do a minute or two, and you are?
I'm Crystal.
Crystal, good, yeah. We'll just do a quick introduction piece. I'm James from Vancouver, and I work with Journey Home Community. We started the ministry about 12 years ago, and our focus is asylum seekers to Metro Vancouver. Particularly families with children, and so that's the group we work with. We'll talk a little more about what we actually do, but let's go over to Ask Me here.
Oh, okay. I'm Crystal Adendu. I don't know what else you want.
Where are you from?
Actually, I'm from Oklahoma, but I've been in Dallas about 14 years, and I live in the area, and I started attending here about a month ago. So I'm a newbie.
Okay,
yes,
good.
Great.
Good.
Yeah, but happy to be here.
Good, yeah, welcome.
So Jared, and just moved to Dallas a few weeks ago with my family. We've been working in China for about 4 years, and we came here because our organization is doing more and more work with refugees, and we wanted to extend their model that seems to be working really well from Phoenix to Dallas. So
Great.
interested to learn about other perspectives, and particularly we bring more international perspective to the table.
I'm Gail. I live in Buffalo, New York now. I've been around the world for the last 30 years or so. I've had a one-track mind, and that is trying to share the love of Jesus with Muslims. So work for Pioneers, and also help to teach and train people who work in Muslim contexts.
Great, thank you. Others may join us, and they're welcome, and we'll just kind of keep going. So we've seen the numbers from a global perspective, and we'll just kind of run through. I won't read what I prepared here, but we'll refer to it and just chat a little bit. And let's just make this a discussion. If you have questions, comments, we'll just have a conversation this morning. So we've talked about the numbers. We've seen those. One that maybe you hadn't seen on the handout there is the number of refugees resettled worldwide, and these figures are from 2016, so last year 189,000 resettled worldwide in 37 different countries. So that's the resettlement contingent so these countries, I think they get together annually in Geneva and decide on what their quota will be for the next year, and each country determines that, and then they work with the UN on particular people groups or population groups that vulnerabilities, all of those things are taken into account as they decide on annual quotas per country. So there's 3 ways refugees come to Canada. We talked yesterday morning about 2 ways that refugees come to North America. So the first that both of our nations have are government-assisted refugees. We call them short-form GARs in Canada. You have the same thing, and that's the population quota I was just talking about. That's the 189,000. We bumped up our numbers in the last year or two in Canada to accommodate a much larger contingent of Syrians. And so between our government-sponsored and our privately sponsored, I think we did about 40,000 Syrian refugees in the last a little less than 2 years. But a number of those were government-assisted. And but that's kind of going back down again in Canada. We're not really happy about that, but the government has targeted 7,500 for 2017, a much smaller number than we were hoping for. The second way is privately sponsored refugees, and are any of you familiar with the private sponsorship program that Canada has?
No.
Okay.
A little bit, but I'd like to know more.
Yeah, and maybe we'll focus a little bit on this. So I think it may have been back in the 80s when Canada introduced this program, and I'm not really good with the history on it, but it may have had to do with the boat people who were arriving, where we introduced, the government introduced a program where private citizens could band together and sponsor families just like the government does. So there's a number of ways they do that. It can be a church group or community group that bands together. It could be, and what happens is sometimes a denomination or a larger entity will become a sponsorship agreement holder with the Canadian government. So they'll go through an application process, and they'll be able to then have smaller groups through that organization. There's about 100 of them that have agreements with the government. And so local churches then will take advantage of maybe their denomination's sponsorship agreement with the government. Then there's also an opportunity for just a group of, they call it a group of 5. So 5 citizens can band together and say, we want to sponsor a family. And that can happen in the community, however, a business, a corporation. What needs to happen is that group must raise enough financial support for that family for a year. And it's all laid out as to how much that needs to be. For a family of 4, I think it's in the range of $30,000 to $40,000 that the group must raise, have that available in trust. But they must also commit to the resettlement of that family. And so there's a task list given, and they need to be prepared as a group to bring that family through the same kind of resettlement process that our government-sponsored refugees go through, and you're more familiar with that process. Then there's a blended visa office referral program, which is a hybrid of government and citizens combining to sponsor a family. And then they each take 6 months of support and work together on that sponsorship. What's really cool about this program is that a church group can actually target a particular family overseas and ask to sponsor that specific family. So maybe they have a family in their congregation who's come maybe through the settlement program, through the asylum program. They've settled in, and then they say, actually my brother and his wife and family are in trouble, and we would really like to have them come. So the church then can apply to privately sponsor that particular family and begin that process. Sometimes it's a long process, and right now there have been so many churches that want to get involved that it's oversubscribed.
Wow.
And the government kind of can't keep up to processing the applications fast enough. Because they do the same overseas screening as other families, and so they want to make sure that everything's carefully done and that proper screening is in place. Paperwork, all of those things take time when you're moving across international borders. So it can get bogged down, and that process can take anywhere from a year to 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the location of that family. Some visa offices overseas can move quicker than others, so there's delays along the way as well. The projection for think that should have been maybe 2017, but under privately sponsors was 16,000. So one of the questions that I raised on the questions sheet, number one, we might just take a minute to discuss that, is how does the public ensure that the government doesn't download their responsibility for refugee resettlement to private citizens? As I think that can easily be the tendency. I mean, we love our private sponsorship program, and it does allow private citizens to get involved and to work with government, but we can all see what could happen, and all of a sudden, oh, here's a way to save immigration money. We get the citizens to carry the bulk of the load. So just a few thoughts. What can the citizens of Canada do to ensure that the government carries their fair share of resettlement?
I wonder if it comes in the negotiation of what the quotas are in terms of paying attention to limits and what's realistic.
Yeah.
So in Canada, who determines limits?
The government does.
Right, but I mean, which branch of the government?
It's probably the Immigration Department. So we have Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. So that's all lumped together under
would that fall under like Parliament or Prime Minister?
It falls under Parliament and then has an immigration minister.
I'm wondering if there's
oversees
so
that.
like in the U.S. we would, for example, write a representative of Congress, or we can contact different departments of the government if we know which department. So if it's what I'm getting at is if it's like a congressional thing, we could write a congressman. I don't know if it's a similar thing with MPs in Canada, where you could write your local MP.
And that's exactly what needs to happen as well, is that if there's a groundswell of support among the citizens, to let their representatives know. So I think that the advocacy is an important piece. There's also an association of sponsorship agreement holders, so these 100 or so folks that oversee those agreements with the government have some voice as well as an organized voice.
So has this been part of a public discussion in Canada? Like people are saying, hey, government, you need to be careful not to do. Like, is it a concern that's?
I don't think it's reached a real high level, but I think it is a discussion with refugee serving organizations. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Can I just ask a question? Because this doesn't exist in the U.S.
No.
Reasons why?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. It would obviously be a very strong departure from current practices, and would require a very strong support at the
grassroots level.
Yeah, and even at your government representatives would have to be very convinced too, because I don't know how your legislation works, but it would probably mean a change in legislation.
Oh, sure, sure.
Well, I know this program I've never heard of, wasn't familiar, with how.
Yeah.
I'm a reading specialist for Richardson, one of the districts here, and I've been in education 24 years. And our problem is, in schools, we don't have the resources or the training really to deal with the refugee families, yet we're having all the influx of recently the Serbians amongst other refugees. And teachers and administrators have no training, and we're having to service their needs and living and help with immigration before we can even get to education. So it's just interesting that these families are sponsoring them with $30,000 to $40,000. That's amazing.
Because then you've got a whole support system for that family.
Yeah.
Not just a financial partnership, but now you've got a concerned group of people who are gathered around that family and sending them through.
That's amazing. Because I know a lot of times the refugees, they lean on the school, but school system, but we really don't have the information.
There's another program
resources.
that's Canadian, it sounds like, or at least in some of our school systems, where we have what we call a SWIS program, SWIS, which is Settlement Workers in Schools. And those are funded positions where a school district would actually have somebody who's trained in settlement, immigration and refugee settlement, and their job is just to be part of the school system
Wow,
and come
that's
alongside
great.
children and families for those very purposes.
Wow.
The other thing that's been interesting is watching, particularly the last couple of years on the world stage, because of the interest in refugees, which has really kind of come forward, is that there are other countries that are looking at the private sponsorship program and starting to do some pilot projects. Australia actually, I think, has had a version of this in place for a few years. The UK is piloting it, and there are some other European countries that are looking at this private sponsorship program and beginning to look at doing some experimenting with it. So it seems like it's catching on, and I think it's a great way to engage local citizens.
I think oftentimes churches in America feel the problem is too big and they don't know how to tangibly.
How to latch in.
You know,
Yeah.
so.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, yeah, I think they could jump on this.
Yes.
I'm interested in trying to find out how to become an advocate for how to get this into the
Yeah.
US.
So, sponsorship agreement holder is the official title given to those who carry these agreements with the government. You might check. I haven't done a lot of work in this area, but you might check to see. They might have a website.
Yeah.
They're called SAW, S-A-H,
Okay.
and seeing if they have,
Thanks for that.
some involvement that way.
Good.
The third area is refugee claimants, asylum seekers. In Canada, we call them refugee claimants. And I think it might be in part to try and not make as strong a distinction, because labels affect how people think regarding groups. And asylum seekers sometimes have a bad rap, or have stigma around them, even more than resettled refugees.
I want to ask just real quick, why do you think that is? I'm just curious.
Yeah,
On why? What's the cause of that?
I think there's a number of reasons. Is that they haven't been determined to be refugees yet, and so the process of how they come is seen in many eyes to be illegally coming, and so that term is used. I don't like the word illegal because people haven't committed a crime. They can also be seen as queue jumpers, so all of these people are languishing in refugee camps and don't have an opportunity to come, and so here's this family that parachutes in from Afghanistan just because they've been able to do that. And so that is viewed as unfair, I think, in the eyes of some.
Okay.
So there's a number of those kinds of reasons that people make these distinctions. So I don't know for that or not, but in Canada, we term them refugee claimants. So almost pre-refugee or people who are making a claim to become a refugee, and so that's the term that's given from the Canadian perspective. Last year we took in 23,000 refugee claimants. I found it interesting how Canada has a population about 10% of the U.S., and when you look at statistics, it's often in that proportion. Canada's like a tenth of what a U.S. stat might be. Not consistently, but often. And so last year I mentioned that there were 262,000 new asylum claims in the U.S. Well, there are 23,000 in Canada, so kind of around a tenth of that number. So that's the third way refugees come. They just show up in whatever way they can get here. So we had a couple from Iran who he was high-ranking officer on a cargo ship, and because he was ranking so high, he could bring his family, his wife and young child, and so he did on this particular voyage. And as they were coming over, they just realized that it was going to be very difficult for them to go back to Iran. So they docked because he was involved in security for the ship. he was able to make the arrangements where they could jump ship,
Wow.
come into the city, go underground until the ship left without them back to Iran, and then they surfaced, and
Wow.
we got connected with them and had them be part of our community, provided housing and support. So that, that's an unusual way, but that is one way. We had a ship arrive in 6 or 7 years ago from Sri Lanka with close to 5,000 Tamils from Sri Lanka arrive and dock, and we were asked to take 10 of those families in our community. So ships, planes, people arrange flights. Maybe they have a visitor's visa,
Well, in my
student visa.
in my neighborhood, they walk across the Peace Bridge.
And
Viva
exactly.
La Casa is a ministry that's
Yes.
there, and that's the way station, and they literally walk across the bridge.
And we have multiple refugees coming into Journey Home community through that very means, because we find the border is pretty porous,
Yeah.
even between Washington and Vancouver. So one of the challenges, and one of the reasons people do that, is because Canada and the US has what we call the Safe Third Country Agreement, where it's kind of the countries have protection. So this agreement says that you must claim asylum in your first country of arrival. So it seems that it's easier to get into the US originally than in Canada to get a visitor visa or a study visa or whatever. So people make their way into the US, and then they come across the border and make a claim in Canada. So Canada and the US made this agreement in 2004, I think, that says, no, you need to claim asylum the first country you arrive in. There are some exemptions. If you have family members in Canada, then you can come across the border. So to arrive at a legal border crossing or an official border crossing, if you have already landed in the US and you say, I'm here to make a refugee claim in Canada, you would likely be turned back. So that's why then people cross the border irregularly on their own. They find ways to go through the bush or find a farm or whatever the situation. You maybe see in some of the newscasts over this past winter of that happening.
Yeah.
So basically, whether they're asylum seeker or refugee, that will affect their, I guess, legal status when they do start.
No, that's the interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
The United Nations Convention for Refugees does not penalize people for how they arrive in the country.
Hmm.
So they're saying human smuggling, false documentation, doesn't matter. Once you land in the country, say, I'm here to make a refugee claim, that is not held against you.
Wow.
They recognize that people are running for their lives and will take whatever means to be able to get to a country of asylum and protection and safety. So that doesn't surface as a mark against them.
I can see that's a great advantage in some ways, but also a disadvantage in that it encourages people smuggling. It doesn't do anything to discourage people smuggling.
And I have some mixed views on that, because the common perception is that it's totally wrong and should be stopped. And yet, if it was completely stopped, would people have the opportunity to gain asylum in other countries?
It's a tough one.
So there's an upside, and I guess what we hope is that people aren't abused too badly in that process of arriving. So that's the third. So GARS, PSRs is the short form for privately sponsored refugees, and then asylum seekers or refugee claimants, as we call them in Canada, of how people come. Some of the things that a group of folks in Vancouver have done to help asylum seekers arrive, one of our sister organizations, Kinbrace Community Society, they've actually instigated a program for asylum seekers where they will arrange for asylum seekers to be able to go to the room where they're going to have their hearing with the Immigration Refugee Board, have a tour of the room, have questions with government officials on what takes place at their hearing, how that process goes. And so it's an opportunity for them to really find out, what are they going to face? How is this going to affect their hearing and their claim? So that's been a really good piece that's been developed and is now being rolled out across the country in Canada. The other thing that they did was they developed this refugee hearing preparation guide, which is an easy to read, illustrated, understanding way for refugee claimants or asylum seekers to find out what really happens in our hearing. What do we need to do? All of the tasks that are prepared for this process that they're going to go through. This is online on our website, I believe. It's published in a number of languages. So you can imagine what it's like for us to go through our own court systems. We don't know the legal language. We don't know the process that is involved. How much more for a family who is not used to a Western legal system, who doesn't have the language perhaps.
Yeah.
So to have something that at least helps them, what's step 1, step 2, step 3, has been a really important piece for
And
folks.
who
like
heads that up? Is that a private organization?
Yes,
And
yeah.
that is,
and they
what's
make
the name of the organization?
Kinbrace Community Society.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it
Is that-
might
is
be
that which-
listed.
Where is it on here? I'm trying to find that.
No, I didn't list.
KINBRACE.
Yes,
Okay.
I didn't list our partner organizations, so it isn't there. But
Wow.
so in Canada, our statistics, apart from the 40,000 Syrian refugees, or including the 40,000 Syrian refugees, were 21,000 GARs, 14,000 PSRs, 4,000 blended government program, and so that's how we arrived at that 40,000. Oh, I did list it under refugee claimants under Metro Vancouver agencies, but not a website there, but Kinbrace Community
Oh, I see
Society.
it. I see it there. Yeah, okay.
So in Vancouver, what we have is Immigrant Services Society, similar to your resettlement agencies, is the Vancouver Government Resettlement Agency, and they have the government contract to look after all of the government-assisted refugees who arrive. Then joint and private sponsorship groups are groups like Mennonite Central Committee, Canadian Lutheran World Relief, other churches and private groups who are part of that private sponsorship program. And then in Vancouver, assisting refugee claimants, we have ourselves, Kinbrace, other groups who provide support for refugee claimants. We'll move into perhaps a little more, less theoretical and more practical section now, and looking at some models of ministry. And these are Christian models, I might say. Most in Vancouver, but also Toronto, of the approach and perspective on how do we respond to these different groups. So the first is Immigrant Services Society of BC. They have been working hard over the last good number of years to construct a welcome center in Vancouver, which is an amazing really refugee center.
Is this a church sponsored?
No. This is
the government.
this is a nonprofit group,
Okay.
Immigrant Services Society.
Okay.
It's the NGO that looks after government-assisted refugees.
Okay, I see.
But they had a vision to establish a center, a one-stop shop for refugees to Vancouver. So with funding, private funding, government funding, corporate funding, they built this center, which just opened about a year ago. They have up to 138 beds in this center of housing units. There's a healthcare clinic, there's multilingual trauma support, youth drop-in childcare, classrooms for ESL,
That's great.
multilingual settlement support staff. It really is an amazing place. And it services, the government is sponsored, but it also has some of these offices that work with asylum seekers. So all of these places have come together and provide an opportunity for refugees to come to one place to get a lot of the services that they're looking for. Right next door to this Welcome Center is First Christian Reformed Church. And they have partnered with churches throughout BC, but particularly in the Metro Vancouver area, to hire a full-time chaplain and refugee support mobilizer. So Dina works in conjunction with the Welcome Center out of the church next door to be a chaplain, to mobilize churches to get involved with the refugee families that come. So you can see some of the programs that the church does through their involvement with the Welcome Center. That's a program that works with government-assisted refugees, and that's their focus.
Well, let me ask the question, if they're not necessarily government-assisted refugees, do they still work with those that can?
They have more limited help for asylum seekers and for privately sponsored refugees. The government funding doesn't support asylum seeker programming as much as it does government-assisted programming. The only real government funding for asylum seekers is that those families can get on to provincial welfare to get their basic housing and settle, or not settlement, but personal needs looked after. So that's an advantage that we have in Canada, which I don't think you have for asylum seekers down here, where they have access to welfare. The second area, and I don't have a slide for it, but it's the small church where we rent our office space in my home city of Burnaby. That's a mixed Korean-Canadian congregation of about 200, and they took on a private sponsorship of a family, of a Syrian family. And so they found the housing, they're providing the support, they raised, I think, the $30,000 to $40,000. They put a refugee team together, and they've been walking with this family for the year that they've been here. Now, of course, the hope is that those relationships continue. So you're formally committed for a year, but the idea is that those relationships will be established and you'll be able to carry on. Now, a lot of these families are Muslim, so this isn't a church growth project. They may not be involved in your church, but it is sharing the love of Jesus and sharing our faith in very tangible ways with folks who come. And there is an opportunity to reach out and share in declaration as well as demonstration as opportunity arises.
What's the name of the church?
Living Hope Fellowship. It's a kind of a second generation Korean congregation, mixed marriages, Caucasian, Koreans. They're starting to develop a little bit of an international flavor, but they're an example of a church that has taken on one of these private sponsorships. The third group is Christie Refugee Welcome Center in Toronto. They found kind of an older townhouse complex close to the downtown area. And in this complex, they house about 60 to 65 asylum seekers at a time. They do singles, families, so they have rooms for the families, they have a common dining room with a cook, and they do all of the services that are needed for settling asylum seekers in Toronto.
Do they house? They don't have resources to house them.
They do the immediate housing, so they can house the 60 to 65, so they stay in the center, live there, until they find them the next stage of housing. So they're rotating people through on a probably 3 to 4 to 6 month basis until people have a chance to get a little bit established. So that's a housing program and settlement program. They have about, as you can see there, about 300 refugee claimants over the course of a year that they would provide help for, and they can accommodate 60 individuals at a time. So they would be rolling those folks through fairly quickly because there's always a lineup of asylum seekers looking for housing and never enough resources available. The last group we'll just talk about is our own organization in partnership with 10th Church. And I'll just move to
And is this your home church? Or is this...
no, this is a partner church that we have established a relationship with. Just a minute, let me go to... So our organization is a nonprofit charity, and we establish partnerships with local churches and community groups. And this is just a shot of our annual picnic, where we gather folks just for a day of fun. 10th Church is a multicultural, multi-site, multi-service church, very justice-oriented, and they've come on board with us over the last number of years, but more officially the last year. And our project really with them is to have them do exactly what we do as Journey Home Community. So we've established a training program, and we train and coach them to take a new family just like we take a new family. So we're really multiplying our capacity to add more families in, but rather than just adding staff and adding houses to Journey Home, our idea is to multiply ourselves through the local church, because we think that a local church can do exactly what we're doing.
Yeah.
The private sponsorship program shows that. So we've developed a refugee claimant or asylum seeker sponsorship program, and we're saying to a church, we'll link you up with a newly arriving family, we'll train you, we'll coach you, you do all of the settlement work, find the housing, get them established, and we'll work with you in that. And it's we piloted that with 10th Church, proved very successful. They're ready to take their second family now. And we have 2 other churches that we've established agreements with and having conversations with multiple others. So this is a really great opportunity for us. This is our most recent refugee house that we established in Vancouver, owned by an elderly couple who have just made it available for ministry. All we pay are the taxes and the utilities, and we've been able to settle a family of 7 from Burundi in this house. They're occupying most of the house, so we have 4 bedrooms right now. There's also another suite downstairs, and so they're kind of making their headquarters downstairs with another kitchen, but kind of taking over the house. They'll be moving out, we anticipate August 1st, so we think this could work for 2 smaller families. And then within each refugee house we have a Christian couple who lives and provides the Christian welcome and the hospitality.
Great.
They're working people, they're just volunteers, but they live in our houses and become available, showing people around the neighborhood, and just being that presence, working through conflicts that may develop, drinking tea, having the occasional meal, and just doing life together with our families. Move out day comes, and of course we have our volunteer crews that help move. Our next stage, apart from our 3 refugee houses, is we have a partnership with our social housing government agency to have 12 units of government housing for supported transition housing for our families. And so this is a couple from Peru in one of the townhouses that we have available through our government program.
That's great.
I think maybe I've shown some resources there. I'll just maybe take a minute to mention those, but I want to leave a little time for questions. Some of the websites that you show there, a few resources, a DVD series that I have found interesting, quite fascinating actually, as an orientation for people around refugee ministry and the refugee journey. So yeah, I think we'll stop there. This goes till 10:15?
I believe so,
Doesn't
yes.
it? Yeah. So let's just have some discussion. I wrote some questions down. Let's review those, but maybe you have your own questions. I just threw out things like the Safe Third Country Agreement that we talked about. Is that an ethical arrangement between 2 countries? Should we be stopping families from border crossing and forcing them to come irregularly across the border? That might be something to discuss. What would be the same and different for a refugee family who arrives on any one of those 3 different pathways. There's different pieces that they have to work through in their refugee journey depending on how they came. What would you say to someone who suggests that asylum seekers are not legitimate because they jump the queue or enter the country illegally? And finally, if you had a church come to you which wanted to reach out to refugees in their city, how would you advise them to get started? So those are some questions that we can discuss or you can take back and just reflect on. But before we move into any of those, did you have questions just on some of the Canadian perspective, the way we do things there, or other questions that might have surfaced from the ministry models that we talked about this morning?
So I thought it was very interesting that a lot of the models that you showed included housing of some form. So to the other Americans here, I haven't seen that in America at all. Have you seen any kind of housing provided to refugees in America? I mean,
Oh, sure.
that
All over the place.
like that?
Yeah, in Buffalo, there's
Really?
Well, there's Viva La Casa for asylum seekers, but then I'm involved in a church that started a ministry that will help refugees find apartments and help them fix them up. Because in Buffalo is going downhill, and lots of empty and abandoned properties. So,
Is that right?
Yeah, both faith-based and non-faith-based agencies are helping these folks find, and Buffalo's experiencing an economic uplift because of it. And those that are further along in the process, who are new American families, are buying homes and refurbishing them and lifting up neighborhoods that had been derelict. So it's a pretty amazing model. But yeah, there's lots of levels of housing.
I just found out, Jared, in coming to Dallas, of a group called DashNet in
Yes, I am
Dallas.
familiar with DashNet. Yes.
And they do housing.
Okay, they do.
So they
Okay.
actually, I understand they're housing like 24 asylum seekers.
Oh, really?
right
Okay.
now. Yeah.
Okay. I need to
So-
connect with them to learn.
Yeah, that would be a
I
great
didn't know that.
opportunity.
One of the questions I had was from your experience, and Gail, maybe you can speak to this as well. But is it ever become kind of an issue of kind of getting them to move along, or do they have a natural desire to then find their own place? I guess I'm
Good
wondering
question.
about kind of over.
Oops, sorry.
You start having lots of families vying for a small number of spaces. Does that kind of become an issue of running out of space, and then you kind of have the lines, or you have to kind of get people to move along? So do you understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah. It is a challenge, particularly in Vancouver, because Vancouver is probably one of the tightest housing markets in Canada, if not in North America.
Incredible.
And so when people find a bit of housing, depending on the family, it is difficult to get into the next stage. With our situation in our refugee houses, with community housing or communal living, I think after a number of months, a lot of families are kind of ready to get on their own, and so that becomes a built-in incentive.
Yeah, for sure.
Others not as much. They would be happy to stay on longer, but probably tougher in our second stage housing, where they're living 18 to 24 months in those government subsidized housing units. That's where it's tougher to move them along. So we have to be very upfront, keep communicating along. This is for this period of time. This is transition. This is not your permanent place. And just be careful in the messaging that we're doing with families.
Right.
And then providing the support will help you find your next place.
Okay.
And making sure that we have the staffing in place to do that. Help them move, help them get their furniture, all of those kinds of
Sure.
things are a supportive way.
Now, do you help them with jobs then? Because obviously that would be a key, having the income to
Yes,
afford.
exactly.
Do you do that, or is there another organization that helps with that?
We have a limited kind of pre-employment program
Okay.
that we help them with and through, and then link them to the job searching groups and services that are out there to do the skills training, to do the job hunt. And then we have informal ways of, people hear about us. Oh, I have an opening here. Okay, then we'll send that out to our families to see if there's any takers.
Which I think, if churches are involved in this too, in a church community, you'll have lots of people in lots of different sectors that might be able to help
Yeah.
incorporate people into jobs. You know.
I had a long-term friend of mine approach us not long ago, and she's actually in the headhunting
Yeah.
business. And she said, you know, my company has actually agreed to pay for me to volunteer a day a month with your organization.
Wow.
And so she's coming now 2 half days, meeting with families, helping them with resume, helping them get a bit of a track to run on. You know, so those kinds of things are surface as you get known and as you have opportunity to make people aware of your ministry. But it is an important piece, because that's the key link to helping them move into market housing and getting them independent.
Well, that's amazing. I don't know, maybe it's this part of the country, but we have our faith-based organizations, and again, I'm in 2 schools, and those are the primary places where our families have to go to find housing. And like I said, schools don't have a lot of resources.
Yeah.
But we wish we had that government support as Canada does, apparently. And it's just a difficult thing for our families, and it might be just in this part of the country. I'm hearing you say in New York, we have more support as far as housing.
You know, that's a good point, Krista, because I think it might depend on different regions, what kind of nonprofits have risen up to provide the extra support that maybe isn't coming through the basic government funding. Because there's no end of help that's needed, no end of opportunity, but you have to have someone with a vision to begin a service and find ways to fund it.
Yeah.
Or find a strong volunteer contingent to resource it, even if maybe it doesn't take a lot of monetary funding.
Yes.
And that may change from city to city, depending on who's had a vision to develop that kind of ministry. Yeah, I think it's a very good point. I think there's probably a lot of disparity across the nation of what's available in what city.
I have another question that goes beyond the bounds of this, but I really appreciate your input as you have so much experience. We are all committed to serving and loving and helping people who are here because they've been forcibly displaced. What is the discussion going on in Canada about addressing the problems in the countries? You know, kind of going to the source of resolving the conflicts that are forcing people out of their countries. What's the discussion in Canada about that? Like, is there any discussion? Or are we so busy kind of just meeting needs that we can't?
I think Canada, I think there's some level of trying to engage. I think we're probably not seen as one of the bigger players on the world stage. We don't have the clout that the EU has, or that the USA has. But I think we're at the same time we're trying to speak into some of those situations and begin to. I think we've tried to have peacekeeping as being one of our areas of expertise. I think that's gone downhill a little bit, but I think maybe it's being revived some. Those are areas that I think it's difficult for us as private citizens to feel we have much voice in,
exactly.
because it happens at such a high diplomatic level.
Right.
So I'm not, I don't have an inside scoop on that, Gail, but I think that there is some discussion around that. I know that I took a course recently on forced migration, and the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees, is in 2018 is actually going through a bit of a strong discussion about reconfiguring the refugee system, because it just isn't working.
Right.
And the UNHCR has very limited power. They only have as much power as nation states give them. But this representative from the UNHCR said that one of the bright spots is that nation states have actually come together and are saying the system is broken. We need to come together and find ways to fix this and address it. So he was hopeful for some maybe some overhaul and some change at a national level, at least for how we're working through the refugee program. But he was saying it could go in any direction. Once it's up on the table for complete revamp,
It could face the chopping block.
it could.
Yeah.
Or if nation states have the appetite for making some strong changes, we could see some progress in that area as well. So it'd be really interesting to see. He said that Canada is playing a fairly major role in that conversation,
Okay.
in that regard. So I was grateful to hear that there might be some opportunity to see some change.
No, I
at
just
that
always
level.
think about this as we as Christians, we are putting a lot of effort into this effort to help take care of refugees. But I'm just wondering if there were
Absolutely.
if there were Christians who were mobilized to be advocates for peacemaking in the location. If there was as much or more given, and lobbying our legislators to say, listen, we've got to. Isn't anybody paying attention to the source of the problem?
Well, and I cut this out of my talk yesterday morning, but I was also going to refer to the fact that we as states, nation states now, need to take responsibility for what we're doing that's complicit
Yeah, exactly.
in producing refugees.
Yeah.
So both Canada and the US have had substantial recent arms deals with Saudi Arabia.
Don't even get me started.
I mean, what's wrong with this picture, And so what are we doing in our economic agendas
Absolutely.
that are creating, potential environmental refugees in the future? And that's going to be a bigger and bigger challenge in the future of the way geography is changing and forcing people out of the places where they've been living and earning a livelihood. So all of those are factors that go into the very thing you're talking about that aren't necessarily directly war related, but are part of this whole
factors,
piece
yeah.
of
Displacement.
of displacement that led to it directly or indirectly.
And I wonder globally, would that ever really be addressed as far as taking steps and measures? Because, if you look at it, we're causing the problem, our governments are causing the refugee problem, but then we're not doing anything to solve it. So
Yeah,
it's kind of
yeah.
a two-way street.
But I think one of the key issues is really what seems to speak is the bottom line. And so if governments
So
can be
often.
convinced that the bottom line would be better for us if we address these, core issues first,
Yeah.
that's what speaks. It's the dollar.
And I think increasingly we become very short-sighted in that bottom line. So it's what makes us profit today,
Yeah.
but we're not thinking about what that's going to cost us a generation later, 15 or 20 years down the road, and so we become very short-sighted in those decisions as well. And we really need to be building these conversations more at those kinds of levels. And I think we see that just in how we operate as citizens and as churches. We're very short-sighted
Yeah.
and not long-term thinking of our strategies and of our program.
I know sometimes as Christians, it's hard not to consider the underlying agenda, the hidden
Yeah.
agenda, but
Yeah.
it is there.
Yeah, we can't ignore that for sure. Anything else before we kind of wrap up?
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Great, thank you for your participation this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jared, for getting us started and looking after this. And I hope you have a good rest of the day and rest of the RHP roundtable here over these next
My
hours.
RAM is almost full.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, 2.5 days is probably about the limit of what we can
That's right.
absorb and work through. So, yeah, bless you as you carry on for the rest of your day.